Ben Rhodes, I promise you, we will get to All We Say,
I
the
know.
book. But I've got to talk to you about Iran.
Yeah.
I've got to talk to you about President Trump's orientation to the state of the war, the objectives, all the things that he continues to say, harshly critical of the nuclear deal President Obama negotiated with the Iranian regime.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Major, you were there at the time.
I was.
Look, there are a lot of things that we did not get right in the Obama years. But I always felt like one thing we did get right was that nuclear deal with Iran. And our basic case at the time was there are only two ways to solve this problem of the Iranian nuclear program. A diplomatic agreement that is roughly like what we got. And you could argue whether certain provisions you might want to tighten or make longer, but the outlines of that kind of deal. Or you'd have to use military force.
And the agreement that you put together was not just the United States and Iran. It was a multi-nation agreement with enforcement mechanisms.
And I think that that's the most important thing because, again, you had the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. So you had not just the United States, Great Britain, and France. You had Russia and China in on the deal, Germany and the EU in on the deal. And then you had enforcement mechanisms that had inspections of the Iranian nuclear facilities and their uranium mines and mills. Like, so literally the entire supply chain, where they pulled the uranium out of the ground, how they enriched it, the stockpile had to be shipped out of the country. And all of that was inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it was very clear what the deal was and it had the force of international law because you had a UN Security Council resolution that said the Iranians break this deal.
And yet President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say over and over and over again, it put Iran on a path to a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and it didn't. I mean, like it actually makes no sense to say that because they had to roll back their program. Now, two things I'd say to be fair to the criticisms. One of the criticisms is that certain elements of the deal had durations, right? Certain restrictions on the Iranian program sunsetted in 10 years or 15 years, in terms of like the numbers of centrifuges they could operate. Now, the two things I'd say about that are, number one, that's not uncommon in arms control agreements. So like we had a New START treaty negotiated with Russia on deployments of nuclear missiles and launchers. But it's a 10-year phase, and then 10 years later, you renegotiate, right? So there's not a tradition in arms control of like permanent arms control deals. Now, the second and more important thing I'd say, though, Major, is Trump pulled out of the deal in 2018, so all the restrictions went away in 3 years. And Iran started doing all the things that people warned that they might do in 10 years in 3 years. So I never quite, there was a kind of cognitive dissonance there that you're blowing up the deal because you don't want them to do things in 10 years, but you're therefore allowing them to enrich at a higher level, allowing them to accumulate a stockpile, and leads to a situation now where the stockpile of enriched uranium they have is much more potent than anything they had in the Obama years. Now, the other thing I'd say is that Netanyahu's criticism of the deal to Congress when he came to the U.S. and gave a speech opposing the deal was that it didn't address ballistic missiles and it didn't address Iranian support for terrorist proxy groups. And look, that's true, but diplomacy is the art of the possible, and the Iranians were never going to agree to that. Now, fast forward, when Kushner and Witkoff were negotiating before this latest war, they were demanding that the Iranians limit their ballistic missile program and their support for proxies, and of course the Iranians said no, and that's when Netanyahu convinced Trump, I think, to do this. I think telling him that it would be easy, that the Iranian regime would collapse. And look, we got the same presentation. Like I was in many a phone call with President Obama where he was talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he was telling him, you shouldn't make this deal. You should use military force. You need to have a credible military option. And we did the war game. And guess what? Every time you did the war game, that's when you sit down and you simulate what might happen. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian regime digs in. It doesn't collapse. Basically, what has happened was eminently predictable. It's anyone who's kind of worked or war gamed on this scenario.
The regime clings to power.
Yeah.
Asymmetric warfare is used, even though it's weakened.
Yeah.
And because of its theocratic devotion to the underpinnings of the revolution, don't give up.
Yes, and because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the hardest core element of the regime, they function not just as a theocratic regime, but as essentially a military dictatorship. And so what's happened now...
And a deeply corrupt one.
So in part because of sanctions, they've basically have a monopoly on, let's say, the dark economy, sanctions busting, all kinds of illicit trade. They had their own sources of revenue. And so they operate well in conflict, and
they don't starve, in other words.
They don't starve. And they don't care about their people. I mean, the same reason that they're odious is why they're dangerous, right? Because right now, Trump is trying to blockade Iran and create hardship for the Iranian people so that the regime comes up with their hands out. They don't care if their people suffer for a few months, as long as they can hold the global economy hostage. And so I think the situation Trump finds himself in is probably the best landing place he could find is something kind of like the Obama deal. Like the Iranians reopen the strait, the blockade's lifted, the Iranians get a bunch of revenue from sanctions relief or from tolling the
And
strait.
then there's some sort of 60-day period to negotiate all these other things.
And then you negotiate something kind of like the Iran deal. And look, it's obviously a tragedy that we're in this situation. It's so unnecessary. That's
do
what's
you
so
think,
frustrating.
before we get to all we say, do you think when we're on the other side of this will have remade the region? Because Gulf states, now having seen kinetic military action undertaken against Iran, unsuccessful in terms of toppling the regime, are now going to be much more hesitant about dealing with the United States or Israel.
Yeah, I think 3 quick reasons. The Gulf states have been put at risk by this war, and they kind of feel like we hung them out to dry. Like a lot of our defenses were directed towards our troops and bases and Israel, and they're getting hit. And so I think they're going to start to look to China a bit. They're going to hedge. I don't think they're going to move entirely away from us, but they're going to start to hedge and do more things with China. Then the Iranians have demonstrated that they can control the Strait of Hormuz. That's a huge game changer. They don't necessarily need a nuclear weapon as a deterrent. And then lastly, if you're Iran and you look at the political fallout in this country over the war and globally, you're probably thinking, I don't think the Americans are going to do this again. And so all of a sudden, the Gulf states and others, I think, will probably have to adjust to that and make their own arrangements with Iran, right? Like, it seems like this regime is here to stay, and they have a deterrent here on the Strait, and the Americans are probably not going to want to get in another one of these wars, and so that's a new region.
All we say, a history in 15 speeches. Most of the speeches are from long ago. There are some from the modern era, but most predate radio.
Yeah.
Anything that we would commonly associate with mass communication in this country. Is there a reason for that?
Well, I really wanted to go back to the origins of the argument that we've been having in this country, like that is so potent right now. I'm a big believer that you have to look to history to understand the present. And as someone who was a speechwriter and not a historian, I also kind of knew that what speeches offer is history in the present tense. This is how people were trying to persuade each other. This is how people are trying to mobilize movements. This is how people are trying to change things. And I wanted to essentially focus on American identity, right? And so what I found is that there are these rich tributaries that run out of kind of the 19th century into today, right? Because I start with Benjamin Franklin, and that's a good starting point for our conversation. He gives a speech at the Constitutional Convention that's the closing argument for the Constitution, in which he notably doesn't mention the Constitution. He mentions the Constitution, but not the substance of it. Right. The entire speech is about compromise and the virtue of compromise. And he says, you get a group of people together in a room, you have all their wisdom, but you also have all their selfish interests, all their prejudices. And you're not going to get a perfect product or agreement out of that. The compromise that he exalted, rightly, made this country possible. But they compromised about big things.
Huge things.
Right? Slavery, the nature of citizenship, immigration, how that's going to work. And so I immediately found that Americans got that. And the first several speeches in the book are the whiplash of the indigenous reaction to that, the abolitionist reaction to that, the Confederate reaction to that, and then Lincoln comes along in the second inaugural, and he's trying to resolve it. And that argument has repeated over and over again, essentially. Now, we're not dealing with slavery, but we're the same questions of identity, of immigration, about
power.
Of power. Who has power in this country? Yeah.
Who has the money?
Yeah.
Who has the power? Who has the ability to uplift? And who has the ability to exploit?
And who has the ability to say, what is American? Who is an American? You know, and who gets to decide that question? Is it the kind of top-down view of American exceptionalism that there's kind of an established order in this country, an established identity, and I'll name, you know, kind of a white Christian Western tradition that was kind of handed off from Europe into the United States. And yes, we have a different political system. Yes, there are different kinds of people here, but that's kind of the core identity. Versus people who say, no, the Declaration of Independence is our identity. All men are created equal. That what America is a process of trying to extend rights, to have an abolitionist movement, which I have in here, suffragette movement, which I have in here, right, a populist movement, which, by the way, is not always left. It can be right too, you know. And so that question of what the nature of being American is and who decides that question is the common thread in every speech in the book.
There are two things that you write in the book, separate from the speeches, that really caught my eye. Page 40. The greatest speeches tell hard truths in simple, direct language.
Yeah.
Page 110. There is a profound lesson that you learn as a speechwriter if you work for someone who understands how to properly deliver a speech. The ability to quiet an audience is far more powerful than the capacity to excite them. The sound of listening is harder to earn than the sound of cheering.
Yeah.
That took me by surprise.
Yeah. So I'd always thought that. I noticed Obama's capacity at times to do that. I remember, I'll tell you a little story. I remember talking to Hillary Clinton about this because she had a tendency, I don't know if you remember, to kind of shout, you know, as a means of raising applause, right? That you feel the energy of the speaker, and I remember saying, like, you know, actually, the best speeches, and if you go back and look at it, there's this ability, because what are you actually trying to do in a speech? You're trying to persuade. You know, you want people to actually listen and think differently after that speech.
So as a reporter, as an observer of political speeches, what I always looked for was a cadence of nods.
Yeah. Well, so that line that you read applied to Lincoln's second inaugural. And, you know, it was amazing. For each chapter in this book, I don't just have the speech. I want to know the life story of the speaker, because where did the speech come from? I want to know the movements that informed that speech. And I also want to paint a picture of the moment in time. The moment in time of the second inaugural is triumphant in some ways and tragic. It's triumphant because the Union is on the verge of victory. Lincoln has been reelected. Washington is a crazy scene. There's wounded soldiers, there's black Union troops, there's people in the streets that are filled with mud because it's one of these rainy DC days. And Lincoln gets up to speak. And by the way, you'll remember, as you pointed out, there's no amplification. Right. So the only people who can hear him are the people who are in listening distance. And there's an amazing anecdote I found, which is that he gets up and he gives a speech that is totally unlike what people expected. He makes no reference to, you know, triumphalism, like we won, you know, no battlefield update. He gave a speech about what was the meaning of this war, what was the purpose of it. And what his core message was that we have an opportunity to have a second founding of this republic.
Can we sanctify this sacrifice?
And he speaks this radical line where he says, if all the wealth piled high by the bondsmen, 250 years of unrequited toil, that's slavery. If every drop of blood drawn by the lash must be paid for by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, essentially, so let it be done. That's the president saying, hey, this sacrifice is worthy. And actually, in a way, we deserved it because of slavery. Pretty intense thing to say. But then he talks about building a just and lasting peace among ourselves. Now, the thing that caught my eye is all the observers at the time, that included Walt Whitman, he was a correspondent for the New York Times, pretty amazing. They noted the silence. and that the only audible response were some of the black members of the audience up front. After everything Lincoln said, were just saying, "Bless the Lord." It had the kind of, it was like going to church, you know. Now that is a powerful, that is better than wild applause. You know, this kind of, this man is telling us what this war was all about.
Who is Red Jacket?
Oh, I love this one. So I felt strongly, you know, that, like, I wanted to incorporate a Native American perspective. And Red Jacket was a Seneca chief. And that's one of the Iroquois nations. And, you know, they're based in upstate New York, what we would call upstate New York in Buffalo or thereabouts. And, you know, these are people that were very powerful before the founding of the United States. You know, they basically had their own union. They controlled a lot of territory, basically from the Ohio River to the coast. And gradually, you know, they lost territory. They sided with the British in the Revolution, so, you know, that was the wrong bet. And Red Jacket is a famous orator who's chosen in 1805 to give the response to a white missionary who's there to essentially say, "Hey, let me come in and convert you guys to Christianity." And Red Jacket had been in all the negotiations where they'd lost land. He'd been party to some bad decisions about, you know, they sold like millions of acres for basically peanuts. And this is kind of the last frontier, their religion. And he gets up and he gives this incredibly powerful, simple speech. I mean, Major, if you read it, I encourage people to read this speech because it feels contemporary.
It is so simple.
It is so, the language is so clear.
And in each paragraph, there is a refrain that is like a outstretched hand.
Yeah, and he basically says, "Look, we appreciate you being here, but let me tell you the story of my people. And the story of my people is we used to be here and run all this place. We were happy, everything was going fine. You white people came. We were good to you. We gave you meat. We helped you get set up.
You gave us poison.
And you gave us poison." I think he's referring to alcohol in that context. And then he basically says, "This is our religion." And he actually makes a remarkable case for pluralism, because he says, if the Great Spirit, that's God, wanted everybody to worship in the same way, why didn't he give everybody the same message? And by the way, you Christians seem to fight amongst yourselves a lot.
You have a book.
Yeah.
Why don't you all agree about what that book says?
You guys can't even agree about your
don't.
book. Yeah. So what now you're going to tell? And it's just this, and he sends the guy away and you know, preserves that part of their identity. What I found interesting about Red Jacket's speech is not only does Seneca still exist, and so that's a testament to people like Red Jacket, but it became anthologized. Like, white people wrote it down. And what I noticed about that is that, you know, the Iroquois Union, the idea of a union of 6 nations, had informed Benjamin Franklin's proposal to have a union of the 13 colonies. Like, the Iroquois influenced the Americans a lot. And that speech influenced Quakers and progressive types who wanted to believe in religious pluralism. So interestingly, it's not just a kind of tragic record of what happened to a once proud people. It's also a record of how American identity has also been informed by people like Red Jacket. Ideas of religious freedom and religious pluralism, and also the kind of awareness that a wrong was done to indigenous people is something that became a part of this kind of invisible nature of what it means to be American.
I've given it away that most of the speeches highlighted in this book, all we say, are from a different era. So listen closely. Wall Street owns this country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. Spoken in 1891.
Yeah.
By a woman named Mary Lease.
That's right.
I'd never heard her name.
She's remarkable. She was one of the leading populist orators, an Irish immigrant's daughter who became a barnstorming Kansas populist. What I loved about this chapter, which is about American populism, is that sounds like Bernie Sanders, right? And even her agenda did. At the same time, she also wanted the union of the white working class of the North and South. And she lamented the extent to which politics during Reconstruction had become about political rights for Black people. She was anti-immigrant. And so you see in Mary Lease the beginning of the strains of populism that led to both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Like American populism has always had two sides. And there's probably no chapter in the book to me that explains our current political moment quite as well as Mary Lease, because we're still having the same debates. Look, this was the Gilded Age. This is a time of rampant inequality. This is a time of anti-immigrant sentiment. I think we can understand where we are now by going back to the past. And by the way, her view and the words she spoke, they run up through FDR, who's in my speech. The New Deal is very much an outgrowth of some of the populist ideas about economic redistribution and empowerment. But they also run through a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment through the 20th century and where we are now. So this competition is not new. And I think we have to recognize there's 250 years of history behind where we find ourselves today.
Anna Dickinson, Idiots and Women.
Yeah.
Never heard of Anna Dickinson either.
Well, I hope people do. She was one of the most famous women in America.
Yes.
When she was like in her early 20s, she addressed a joint session of Congress. She was an abolitionist suffragette and a dynamic speaker and apparently like a strikingly beautiful woman. And she addresses Abraham Lincoln in the joint session of Congress during the Civil War to argue for equal rights for Black people, to argue for equal pay for Black soldiers. And then after the Civil War, she's barnstorming the country. There was a speaker circuit where people would travel and give hundreds of speeches over and over. And they were kind of the pop stars of their time.
Right.
Like she was kind of the Taylor Swift of her time, because there weren't amplified music concerts. People came out to public spaces to see people speak. People collected cards with Anna Dickinson's picture on them, like we collected baseball cards, Major, I think you did, when we were kids. Idiots and Women is a suffrage speech in which she notes that after Black suffrage was granted in the 15th Amendment, the only people left in the United States who don't have the right to vote are mentally disabled people and women. Right. And so she speaks almost like a stand-up comic, you know, this lacerating satire.
This absurdity.
This absurdity. Now, the end of the story is the craziest part. Like a lot of women, tragically, who become built up and famous in their youth, by the time she gets into her 40s, she's kind of forgotten. She's not making money anymore. She's holed up in her room. She's drinking too much. It's like a Behind the Music documentary, right? That we used to, that's probably dating me.
Me too. And
she gets committed to an asylum. So she's literally a woman who's treated like an idiot, you know? And there was a eerie lesson in that, you know, about how we deal with fame, honestly, about patriarchy, you know, like, these people from the past, she was not obscure. Mary Lease was not obscure, but, you know, America moves on, you know.
In the modern era, relatively, you have three speeches. I Have a Dream, Barack Obama's speech in Philadelphia, which I covered after the Jeremiah Wright situation, explosion, scandal, whatever you want to call it.
You were there.
Fill in the adjective.
And Reagan. I have Reagan.
Reagan. And Reagan, the Evil Empire. That's right. Reagan, Evil Empire. And then Donald Trump's second inaugural. Yeah. Of those four, take your pick.
Well, let's do Trump, because do Trump in relation to the other ones. Okay. Because I think Trump is in many ways an effort to kind of undo what King was talking about, in the sense that King's speech like spoke into being this awesome momentum of the civil rights movement that also becomes a larger federal government that is, you know, more committed to enforcing civil rights laws, but also at the same time you have great society. Reagan comes along and he's kind of the first reaction against that. Right. Builds a coalition with words of Christian conservatives, evangelicals, national security hawks, and kind of small government conservatives. Right?
And libertarians.
Like, the three legs of the stool.
Right.
Obama comes along, builds kind of different kind of coalition. It's a multiracial coalition that says, if we can get beyond these identity politics and have a kind of unity, that speech, the race speech, is really at core about if we can accept our differences and accept our complexity. We don't have to insist that everybody thinks the same way, but if we can agree upon some common things, we can actually solve these problems. Like, it's the people that divide us that get in the way of things like healthcare and education. Now, Trump comes along in his second inaugural, and he kind of says, this competition I've been talking about, their history is over. I won.
Right.
Like, not only my story, like, I, Donald Trump, have won. He says in that speech, I was saved by God to make America great again. That's somebody saying,
on my terms.
On my terms. And I found the Trump speech interesting because it was simultaneously in the continuum. Like, you can look at a lot of things in American history that lead into Trump. Some and beliefs that I don't always agree with, but I'm not right about everything, and there's obviously a place for them in this country. Like the idea that maybe we should have a smaller government, or maybe immigration needs to be more controlled, or even some of his kind of impulses towards like a certain application of American power in a less restrained way. That's not new. I think what is new, where he is a break, is that compromise that Franklin talked about. For that nation to endure, this competition has to take place within the agreed upon rules.
Right.
Like, we have a constitutional system. We don't just have elections, we have laws, we have norms, we have processes for resolving our differences and living together. And where I think Trump is a deviation is when those are not useful to him, he just ignores them. And that's new. Mm-hmm. I could not imagine Ronald Reagan, who was also who was shot in a way that Trump even wasn't, coming out after that and saying, I was saved by God to make America great again. No. Even though actually Make America Great Again was a Reagan slogan.
From 1980.
And so that's a good place. It felt like a good place to end the book, because I'm sure a lot of people who tend to agree with me will not like seeing Trump in that continuum, but he is. But we have to understand both where he comes from and also where he's different. And I kind of end in the epilogue with this argument that to get past this moment, I think we need to recover the capacity to do political storytelling. Like, we are living in the social media age. We consume information that is designed to trigger us, to be angry at the other side, or to be reinforced in our own beliefs. And speeches may seem anachronistic, but that's kind of where we talk it out. That's where we make arguments and listen to each other. And without speeches, there's no Ronald Reagan. Right. There's no Barack Obama. Like, these are people that launched with a speech. They built coalitions with a speech. And my advice, mainly to Democrats, because I don't think Republicans usually take my advice, is don't lose that. I mean, sure, show up on social media, do podcasts, do all these things, but what's the story you're telling? Mm-hmm. I think people are desperate for that story.
So I may have missed the word. It might be in here, but I'm going to guess it isn't. I'm going to guess that there isn't a celebration of authenticity in this book.
Oh, there is. There
okay.
is. Yeah.
Well, then I'm wrong, because I'm wondering if what you were driving at a second ago is remember the speech, remember the direction, remember this larger story in which you find yourself a part in this persuasion effort can be lost if all you're trying to do is drop F-bombs and be authentic.
But here's how I look at authenticity and define it as a speechwriter, because I had to think about this. Whoever is delivering a speech should be the only person on earth who can deliver it. Sometimes people think, oh, they're speechwriters and there's just a bunch of words. Well, if I had read aloud the words that Barack Obama, the Yes We Can speech or the race speech, it would have been absurd, right? The reason I spent so much time with the people in this book before getting to the speeches is I want to understand why they were the only people that could deliver that speech. And I think the American people can smell that. It's not enough to stand up and give a 5-point plan. And certainly the Democratic Party has fallen in this trap where they sound like they focus grouped everything to death. I'm here to talk to you about middle-class economics, or the bottom-up, middle-out, or these things that everybody says they like in the focus group. But when someone says it, it doesn't sound like a human is talking to them. I think the authenticity is not necessarily just there's a kind of phony authenticity. Like I'll curse and, I'll go on a podcast and, show that I can talk about, UFC or something. Fine. The real authenticity is not just what do you want to do as a politician or activist? Why do you want to do it? What in your life?
What risks you're prepared to take?
What risks you're prepared to take? What are you willing to, like Obama used to say to us sometimes, what are you willing to lose an election over?
Right.
That ironically, you can't win an election unless you convey to people that there are certain things that you'd be willing to lose an election over. And here I will be, I think that's part of what frustrates people about both the Republicans and Democrats now. The Republicans are so afraid of standing up to Trump, it just seems like they just want to stay in power. Like, oh my God, the worst thing that could happen to me is I could get primaried like Thomas Massie or something. And then the Democrats are so desperate to figure out some formula in a laboratory of poll-tested language and positions that you kind of don't even know what they really believe at core. Not all of them, but some of them. And again, the authenticity is, what do you really believe in? What are you willing to take risks for? And why? Like, what in your background, what in your experience is behind that motivation?
I'm sure you've had this conversation. It's not about the book. It's about President Obama and how America got President Trump because it had President Obama. Because there was this orator who was perceived as that, who wasn't as decisive, wasn't as aggressive, wasn't as muscular, and the natural pendulum swing, which you've seen before in American presidential politics, inexorably took us to Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that for,
quite some time,
9 years
I'm gathering.
now. Yeah. I think there's a part of the pendulum swing that is tied to, like David Axelrod used to say, our campaign strategist, Americans tend to elect the opposite of the person before, right? George W. Bush is followed by Barack Obama, and
George W. Bush followed Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, yeah, we Americans look for something different than the person before. So in some ways, Obama is this incredibly sober, process-oriented, unflappable, calm leader. And so there was probably some natural inclination to have something different. I also think, and I'm not somebody who ascribes everything in the world to race, but I do think that precisely because Obama was a relatively conservative personality, and I'm not saying a conservative politician, but he was not, trying to upend the system, I think the thing that was most polarizing about him to certain parts of the country was his race. And I think that Trump captured that mood. He was willing to say at times the quiet part out loud. He kind of created one big other that was not just Obama, but it was kind of Obama and people crossing the southern border and, Iran. And this is a foreign other, a non-white other, And
a birther other.
A birther other. Well, let's face it, you were there. He launched his political ascent with the birther movement. I mean, That's an indisputable fact.
I was in the press room when the president came out.
Yeah, you were there when he gave the birth certificate. And so, again, I think where I'm very sympathetic to Obama is the most polarizing thing about him was something he couldn't do anything about. And actually, but if you look at history, every advance for civil rights is usually followed by some backlash. Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, the Obama presidency. So there's another thing about this book. There's an inevitability that every time all of a sudden, whoa, this country's changing. The president is black. And actually, and I write about this, the Obama presidency was radical less in policy, but in presentation. You were in our White House. It was the most diverse White House that there ever been. The kind of people that were celebrated were very diverse. The kind of cultural moment was kind of the Hamilton moment, if you will, And so I think that that did contribute to. It's not that everybody that voted for Trump is racist. But I think there's a subterranean sense of wait a second, this change things feel like they're changing fast. Trump comes along, he creates, in the same way that I've seen leaders do in other countries, like Viktor Orban did this in Hungary, you create this big other that is scary, and you kind of blame that other for things that it's not really responsible for, like deindustrialization.
And to paraphrase William F. Buckley in a different era, you stand athwart history and yell stop.
Yeah, and Make America Great Again is saying stop, and saying let's roll back the tape to before the civil rights movement.
I could sit here for another 2 hours. You don't have 2 hours. I wish I did.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you one last question, because it's 15, so I want to know who are 16 and 17.
Oh, man.
Who's on the cutting room floor? Because there had to be a cutting room floor.
Gosh, no, there is. I had 100 plus speeches. Well, I'll tell you one that was cut because I couldn't use it. Pat Buchanan's 1992 speech to the Republican convention.
I was there on the floor in Houston.
If you read that speech,
I have.
It is Trump before Trump.
Absolutely.
That is, people who say Trump came out of nowhere.
Not true.
Go read Pat Buchanan. He wanted to build a wall. He declared a culture war.
And he wanted tariffs.
Yeah, he wanted tariffs.
And a reindustrialization of America.
So now, actually, I end up using Trump instead, and I have a lot of Buchanan in there. So that's definitely one. And then, actually, John F. Kennedy's address on civil rights, which doesn't often get as much attention as his inaugural address or his speech in Berlin. He gave this remarkable Oval Office address on civil rights that he was rushed. He told his team, it was when they were trying to desegregate one of the schools in Alabama, and the governor there was standing up to it, and it was a mess. And he said, I'm going to address the nation tonight. And he did it so hastily that he had to ad-lib like the last half of the speech. And it's a very potent, it's when civil rights was mainstreamed. Kennedy really pulled it into the mainstream. I think he doesn't get enough credit for it, frankly, because LBJ rightly gets credit for the legislation. I tucked some of it in, but I was really, because in the end, I actually think the King's speech is obviously more consequential, and I couldn't really do both. So those are two.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt anywhere close to the cutting line?
I've got the Four Freedoms in there. The inaugural address, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address. But I wanted at times, Lincoln's second inaugural and King's I Have a Dream are, probably the two of the greatest hits album that are in here. Mm-hmm. I wanted this to
they were not greatest hits.
I didn't want it to feel like an anthology. I didn't want to feel like, I wanted to surprise people.
You
Anna
did.
Dickinson, Mary Lease,
You
Red
clearly
Jacket,
did.
right? That's what Pat Buchanan would have been like that too, frankly. But because I think it's important to recognize that it's not just the established canon that made us who we are. It's all these other people.
Ben Rhodes, what a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Major. It was great.
Thank you.